When new issues and new questions arise involving children, learning, and new technologies, I'm always interested to hear what Mimi Ito has to say. A professor at the University of California at Irvine, with PhD degrees in both anthropology and education, Mimi is, in my mind, one of the world's most thoughtful and insightful researchers studying the ways that young people engage with new media technologies. Over the years, what's really stood out to me about Mimi is her deep commitment to a child-centered, youth-centered perspective. She's always exploring what young people are interested in and how to help young people build upon their interests and build upon their strengths, to help them in learning new skills and also in forming productive relationships with other people and for developing a sense of belonging within a community. Mimi clearly recognizes and respects that young people have diverse interests and diverse identities, and she's always focused on developing inclusive, welcoming environments that support all young people in exploring and building upon their interests, whatever they may be, with special attention to young people who have been overlooked or underestimated or marginalized. This youth-centered, equity-oriented perspective forms the basis for an approach to learning that Mimi and others have called connected learning. And Mimi's done a remarkable job of building a worldwide network of researchers, educators, and designers around this connected learning approach. For this episode of the podcast, I was particularly interested to talk with Mimi about the ways that she's applying this connected learning lens to two topics that are attracting a lot of attention these days: artificial intelligence and neurodiversity. There are many different opinions and different ideas swirling around these two topics in current conversations about education and learning. So I found it very useful to hear Mimi's perspectives, and I think you will too. Hi, Mimi. Thanks so much for joining on the Lifelong Kindergarten podcast.
Happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
I think we first met, it was probably like 20 years ago, right as you were sort of taking a leadership role on what was then called the Digital Media and Learning Initiative and Community. That was right as more and more children around the world were getting access to digital technology. So it's something that was really, rising in catching people's attention. But maybe we could just start by saying a little bit about what some of the main motivations and core ideas that were behind getting started with digital media and learning, initiative and the community that grew out of it.
Yes. So the Digital Media and Learning Initiative was a MacArthur Foundation initiative that ran, for about 15 years. And it was really kind of investigating the question of how young people were learning differently with the advent of new technologies. And then they eventually launched an initiative that brought together researchers, technology developers, educational leaders to not only research and investigate the space, but to experiment with new alternatives for how to tap into these new technologies and the energy that young people were bringing into the space. And that eventually built out into a big initiative in this area.
Yeah, and I do think one thing, as you said, there's a whole community that grew out of that, a community of researchers and others. I also think there was a network of ideas that grew. And one thing that at least I see that it served as a foundation for the growth of what became known as the connected learning framework that you and others developed, that I think has been in recent years, over the last decade, has had its own community growing around it. Maybe you can say a little bit about how the ideas around the connected learning framework grew out of the ideas that you were developing at that time.
Yeah, so the connected learning framework is really kind of a research and design framework that both describes a certain form of learning, but also provides some values and design principles for how to create environments that are supportive of connected learning. And we synthesize this into a framework that is basically positing that young people learn best, or maybe I shouldn't say best, that the basic framework is that there's a form of learning that is incredibly impactful, which we call connected learning, which happens when young people are pursuing something that's of genuine interest to them or relevant to them with peers and caring adults who share those interests and goals, and those practices are oriented towards something that opens up opportunity for them in life, whether that's academic, civic, or work related opportunities. And what we found with young people's digital media and learning was that in their everyday lives and in their lives out of school, most young people have interests, and a lot of them are increasingly digitally connected, whether it's fandom or whether it's related to supporting their communities or whether it's athletics or arts or whatever it might be. And a lot of those interests are being fueled and supported by online communities and digital tools and new ways of connecting and expressing through digital channels and platforms. But most of those interests, especially when they're digital ones like gaming and fandom that is happening online, most of those interests are not connected to schools, civic institutions, or workforce opportunity. And so there was a big intergenerational disconnect between what young people were actually engaged and activated about and what their teachers and parents and employers were paying attention to. And so our goal in connected learning as a method for, changing how we do things was to try to connect what young people were doing in their digital interests, meet them where they are, and appreciate and connect them to the kind of learning that grown-ups care about.
And I do think for me, there was some core, what I saw as the core pillars or guiding principles that I could really relate to, that it was learning that was interest driven and relationship based and equity oriented. And I think one thing that's really struck me is it felt like everything you were trying to do was to make sure to let young people build on their interest, support them in forming those type of relationships with peers and with others, but to do it in a way that was really recognizing kids from all different backgrounds and different situations and elevating those who hadn't had opportunities. And I think for me, it really resonated with in our own group, we talk about these 4 Ps: projects, passion, peers, and play, which I think lines up in many ways, the passion with interest driven and the peers with the relationships. Right. So I do think, and also trying to reach broadly. So I think I really appreciate the way that I felt you always brought a lens, that some core principles that you could use as a lens for everything you were doing.
Yeah, I think that we've talked about this a lot, Mitch, but there's so much alignment with creative learning. And, again, I think there's, a value to both having, frameworks that might have a slightly different emphasis, like you're focused on creative learning and projects, and we're leaning into things like the connecting across settings and the relational piece, but we both recognize the value of the principles that we're each foregrounding. And I think we've always had really productive cross-pollination. And I also really appreciate your kind of highlighting the equity angle with connected learning, because the outcome of letting young people follow their interests and the things that they feel deeply connected to, the outcome is equity. And what afterwards, people are increasingly understanding and taking up and describing as culturally sustaining or community connected approaches, that was always central to the vision of connected learning. But when we started out, there wasn't a lot of language for that in the field, but we're very happy to be increasingly integrating the language around community connection and culturally responsive and sustaining approaches, because like creative learning, I think they're very aligned. And so connected learning is kind of a big tent framework that we hope can bring people together who share the same values.
I want to talk a bit about how you apply some of those sort of guiding principles and framework that you've developed into things that you're thinking about now. So I want to talk some about some of the big issues that are circulating around kids and technology. and also talk about some of the projects that you specifically are working on. But let me just start with some of the big issues. Obviously, these days, it's hard to go to any conference or conversation about kids and technology and learning without having somebody ask about artificial intelligence. And I think it's important to be developing a certain perspective for thinking about it. I know we've been, again, on some advisory boards dealing with different organizations that are dealing with these issues. And I know I'm still grappling with a lot of the issues. So I want to talk with you about how you've been trying to keep some of that connected learning framework in mind as you think about some of these issues with AI. Like I remember on one advisory board we were on, I think we were both feeling they were focused so much on, it was someone who was creating an AI platform. They were so concerned, is it going to give correct information? And of course, it's a problem if it doesn't give correct information. And remember, you said, well, although that's important, I'm much more concerned about what relationship the kids form with the technology and do they trust it or not? And I thought that was a really good interjection. And it feels to me that grows out of some of the connected learning thinking.
Yeah, I feel like with every new wave of technology, there's sort of these new opportunities and sort of fears and public discourse and concerns that arise around it. And then, young people's engagement often becomes the tip of the sphere of, people being afraid or wanting to regulate. And that's definitely happening with this wave of AI. And, there's all of the conversations of what's happening in school around cheating and like misinformation. And then there's all the concerns around addiction and well-being and so on. And in a lot of ways, it's kind of an extension of all of these things that, Mitch, we've been observing over the past 20 or 30 years, where these technologies are, I see them giving more agency and the opportunity to do interest-driven and youth-centered learning. And the pattern is always that the grown-ups kind of freak out about there being more agency and wanting to clamp down, and regulate and like fit it back into the box that we've had, around what teaching and learning should look like. And that example you gave is a good example, is the field is still trying to optimize for that old version of top-down learning rather than optimize for a new vision that is actually supported by the technology, where young people have a lot of more agency, autonomy, and choice in what they pay attention to, how they express themselves, what they can create. And yet we're not really focused on those questions and still trying to prevent cheating or, get the correct answer. And these frameworks for top-down learning that have been outdated for quite some time now, actually.
Yeah, no, I really like the way you frame it. That what's most important is the children's agency. Actually, as I've been thinking about it, sometimes people talk about agency in terms of choice and voice. And I do think what's most important is to make sure that children continue to have choice, that they can explore the things they want to explore, and then voice, they can learn how to express themselves. Unfortunately, a lot of the ways that AI is getting into schools, I think, has a risk of limiting students' choice and voice. And to me, it's so important to make sure that we help support that, as you were saying.
Yeah. And I think it's like, what are we spending our energy on? We're spending our energy on playing whack-a-mole on cheating and like trying to optimize for accuracy versus like realizing that AI is never going to be 100% accurate. And how do we support young people in kind of investigating and asking the right questions and, having healthy relationships with AI that are supportive and involving their peers and caring adults? What are the contexts that we can build in order to make the engagement with AI more productive, to help mitigate some of the risks and also to maximize the opportunities? Like, those are the questions that I want to be asking, rather than how can we design a more accurate algorithm? How can we like teach kids these skills for like identifying what's wrong in this narrow set of conditions, which is like basically school-based scenarios. So I think the energy that people are spending on, a certain set of problems and practices, I really wish would shift to a more co-constructive approach with young people and supporting their agency and creativity and choice rather than the regulating and locking down kind of impulses that I see in the space right now.
Yeah, I remember it also came up uh, in one of the conversations we were in about just the who has access to the children's data and whether parents or teachers have access. And remember you making the point, having aggregate data can be useful for making the systems better, but there's a real risk of others having access to individual data. And I think you point out there can be an equity angle too, that oftentimes the data could be used in punitive ways towards sort of
Hmm.
the more marginalized groups and
Yeah,
issues like
yeah.
that to be looking at.
Yeah, exactly. So thinking about the design of those social context and the relational context is just as important as, the features and variables in the technology. And again, the relative weight that's being thrown at the technology tweaking versus the social and contextual and practice-based design is completely out of whack. And that's why the practice and the supportive relationships and environments, they're always kind of underappreciated and under resourced. And I think that's one of the things, Mitch, that I appreciate about like how you've developed the Computer Clubhouse or Scratch is that you're designing the technology, but you're also spending a lot of energy designing the social environments, educating the educators as much as you're educating the children, and thinking about design as a social, cultural, and technical phenomenon that has to be moved forward together. And unfortunately, the level of investment should actually be just as high on the social and cultural side, and it usually isn't, unfortunately.
Yeah, I totally agree. Let me ask one more AI issue that I know I've been struggling with. I'd be interested how you're thinking about it. Again, I think it was at one of the meetings we were at. A colleague who I think we both have great respect for, a researcher, said that he thinks what's most important as it was a company designing an AI platform for kids, is saying it's really important that the kids feel heard and seen and listened to. And of course, part of me fully understands that. If you want to be a good, mentor, facilitator, you want to make sure that, in working with a young person, that they do feel seen and listened to, and you really are taking seriously what they're saying. On the other hand, I felt uncomfortable shifting that over directly to the role of an AI agent. And that in some ways, I worry that it gives type of false trust and a false type of relationship and connection. So even though I was understanding why he felt it would lead to a better learning experience, I worried about the relationship that would be forming and the ways that the child would be thinking about their relationship with the technology. I wonder how you think about that.
One of the things that I've noticed just as an observer and being part of these debates about AI and kids is that a lot of times, especially in Western contexts, I think that the issue gets boiled down to whether the AI is replacing humans or not. And we're comparing AIs to humans. So both saying like, oh, AIs can't reach the benchmark that humans do in whatever, like empathy, true understanding, all those things. And that's kind of what we keep debating. And then we, those of us who are humanists are like, well, AI is never going to reach those benchmarks, and uh, we shouldn't be replacing teachers with AI, and so that's kind of how a lot of the debate runs. Versus asking the question about what is AI and how is it a different kind of being that has a different set of capabilities. So it's not that the AI should be doing the things that humans do really well and AIs do really poorly, which is empathy, understanding, mirroring, like that kind of spidey sense you get when you're connecting with a kid. Like that's like really, really hard. And versus, like machines do certain things like in a lot better than human brains do. And what if we take that framework to how kids relate with AI? Like, I often analogize with our other non human companion species, which are our pets, where we have incredibly deep relationships with pets, and dogs do things so much, some things so much better than our human companions do. But we would never like say, sometimes we ask, is a dog replacing a human companion? But we understand that the strengths and the nature of the relationship with our non-human companion species is really, really different. And I wish we would ask those same questions with AI rather than saying, is it going to replace a teacher? Is it going to replace a therapist? And it's like, it's not. It should be different. And it's not enough just to say human AI teaming. We have to understand what that relationship really looks like, feels like, especially for children, and what is good about it and what is different about it, as well as the risks.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I'd love to have it be seen as a separate category, as you were saying. But it's then, I think, a design question. I worry a lot of the designers of AI platforms are purposely trying to blur the boundary and make it seem more human, anthropomorphizing, personifying in ways that make it more difficult to see it as this different type of thing. Because I'm saying that it's wonderful in so many ways, but we should see it as a different type of wonderful, just as you said, as with pets. Anyway, these are things I hope more people can start to ask those types of questions and start to design systems that don't blur boundaries or add confusion in ways that they shouldn't. Maybe I can shift to, I know that you're starting some new projects that I was interested in talking to you about that I think also build off of the connected learning framework, but applying it some new ways. I know one of that's the work you're doing on neurodiversity, and the connection with that and connected learning. I know an immediate reason for getting interested in this is that your brother Joey, who I also know very well, has a daughter on the autism spectrum, and he was looking for schools and didn't see things satisfying and is starting his own school for her and others. And it has led you to start doing some research in this area. But I see it as very connected to research you've done in the past, even if it wasn't directly in neurodiversity. But again, back to I think you've always been doing things to try to uplift people who have come from communities that have been underappreciated. So maybe you can talk a little bit about how you're approaching this, how you became interested in focusing more on issues around neurodiversity.
So, Mitch, as you said, like a big, motivation was, our my niece, Joey's daughter, and kind of realizing in Japan, where they're living now, that there's very few sort of asset-based or strength-based approaches to autism that are available there in general, and certainly no international schools that serve kids like her who with relatively high support needs. In the US as well, what dominates the field is kind of a more behaviorist approach to therapy around autism, where, in our fields on the learning side, there's obviously parallels where, Mitch, you and I come from a more developmental tradition, for me, more specifically, a sociocultural perspective to learning, which is in contrast to a more top-down behaviorist model of training and offering rewards for, good behavior or learning versus like a more learner-centered, interest-driven approach. So as part of trying to understand how to support her better, Joey and his wife discovered this approach called DIR floor time, which is kind of the opposite of the behavioral approach, and it's very values aligned. And so this new school we've been involved in that Joey started with his wife, and also Rizuki Matsumoto, who is best known for bringing Reggio Emilia to Japan, is building on the DIR floor time approach, and also trying to integrate inquiry and project-based approach to supporting neurodivergent kids. But it's also incredibly aligned with connected learning, as you said, Mitch, because it's really taking that kind of strengths and asset-based approach and really bringing it into a new domain, at least new for me, I should say. There's obviously people who have been working on this in the field for a long time, and saying, how can we appreciate what is often pathologized, especially for autistic learners, as like restricted interest, which is part of the pathology, or how autism has gotten medicalized, and that some of the strengths that autistic learners have, which is really deep and specialized interests, a lot of focus, sociability that's centered around interests versus like the more neurotypical status, social hierarchy oriented socializing. And how can we build on that as a strength rather than pathologize that as a deficit? And so it's been really great for me because we have a lot of neurodivergence in our family, not just my niece. And it's been a way of connecting a lot of the personal things that I've experienced personally and my family has experienced with some really practical questions about how you support learners of diverse neurotypes with some of the principles of connected learning, which is building environments where adults are really trying to understand and connect with young people's particular strengths and capacities and interests, and stretching our community, and realizing that a lot of the work that we've done historically, Mitch, in game-based and online learning actually has always over-indexed for neurodivergent kids, and that's the same.
And I do think,
yeah.
I liked before when you talked about how different people can view deep interest, and you talked about, you said in quotes, restricted interest. I think we've both over the years been interested in creating environments and communities around deep interest, and we really value deep interests, and we value people having different interests, and a lot of times that's not something always accepted. But separate from neurodiversity, I think we've always tried to see how we can help support people go deeper with their interests as opposed to steer them away from them.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think DIR Floor Time has taken that approach with autistic children, and our environments like Scratch, or connected camps, our Minecraft and Roblox programs, a lot of the project-based environments, we haven't been explicitly designing for autistic learners, but there's a reason why they show up. And it's also been connecting to the work that I've done over the years around otaku culture and media fandom, because those are also spaces where kids and people of all ages have permission to like really geek out and go deep on interests that other people might not be interested in, to talk forever about them. And those are exactly the kinds of behaviors that are often pathologized as antisocial or inappropriate among the mainstream, when they look at autistic forms of sociability as being kind of weird or inappropriate.
Yeah, I do think it's something we have found in the Scratch community, where there's a large subcommunity in Scratch of young people on the spectrum who really get into Scratch, where they can sort of get focused on things, and they're encouraged to be able to follow an interest, show it deeply. In fact, one of my favorite Scratch projects of all time was by an 11-year-old who is on the spectrum, who created a Scratch project about what it's like to be on the autism spectrum. And he talked about how he does things differently, and he tried to show how it's wonderful that you can do things differently. And he said, I solve problems differently. I sometimes do it in ways even my teacher couldn't even have thought of. And he sort of has this pride of doing things differently. And as you were saying, he sees difference as a strength, which so often doesn't happen. And we often then quote, he ends up by saying the most important lesson is you be you. And so we often say that around here, you be you. And I think Scratch, part of its success is because it's a place where it's possibly you be you. Or in the same project, uh, he has a part where he has these two characters that look the same, and he said, if everybody thought the same way, the world would be a boring place. And so again, valuing that difference among people is just something that I think both of us have tried to work in environments that do value that, but too often doesn't happen in society. And I can see how it then connects over to the work you're doing now with neurodiversity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it does also connect back, Mitch, to some of what we were talking about AI as well. Is I think that there's historically been kind of a lot of stuff around technology and autism and supporting kids to, you know, better conform to neurotypical forms of sociability. But in fact, there have been, online communities and spaces that have been organically supporting that diversity for quite some time. And with AI, I feel like there's this huge opportunity for a vision of personalized learning that is genuinely interest driven, socially supportive in a way that is wrapped around that inherent diversity of kids' interests and ways of socializing rather than, normalizing and conforming. And yet, I think the vision of personalized learning that has taken hold in the field is more about, how can you have different pathways to a standardized outcome versus how can you build and support the natural diversity of neurotypes and interests and strengths and ways of contributing. And I think that's the big challenge for our field, Mitch, whether it's in or out of school learning, is how can we have an AI powered learning environment that builds on that natural diversity and personalizes around that versus is guided by those kind of more behaviorist standardized goals.
Yeah, it's challenging that the word personalized gets adopted in very different ways, so it gets confusing because everyone wants to grab onto the word, but I agree with you, they use it very differently. As you know, sometimes here we use the metaphor of trying to create environments with a low floor, high ceiling, and wide walls. We're easy to get started, can do more complex things. But the wide walls, I think, is what connects with this, that we want to make sure that people from different backgrounds, different interests, different ways of thinking, all have their own pathways that are meaningful to them, but can still be full and active participants.
Yeah, absolutely. And that natural diversity is a societal and cultural strength, right? Rather than a weakness. So it's not just about like coddling kids to do whatever they want, which is kind of the worry that some grown-ups bring to this space. Like, oh, they still have to learn the stuff they don't want to learn, and like it's just not fun and games all the time. And that's kind of the pushback we sometimes get. And it is true that kids need to stretch themselves in areas that they might not have a automatic disposition to, but it's usually when there's a social environment that is setting shared goals and a sense of purpose that they can contribute to. It's through that social connection and understanding what other people are seeking or how they can help other people that they stretch, rather than the kind of standardization of like everybody has to be good at these 5 things that really authentically motivates kids. And so I do feel like, when you look at organic communities like Scratch, you see kids specializing and contributing to each other's projects in different ways. And there's a real strength, but also joy in that as well.
Yeah. Yeah. It's some of this alternate ways of using personalization. I remember seeing one AI system that was helping kids learn vocabulary words, but it was using their interest areas to use it in a sentence that was related to what they were doing. And of course, that might be better than the ways kids learned vocabulary words in the past. But for me, is it really important to be focusing so much on kids learning vocabulary words? And it'd be better if they were learning those vocabularies while working on projects they cared about.
Yeah, yeah.
I do see that I also relate to 20 years ago with the rise, well, with the rise of the internet and social media. I think there are a lot of the same issues that it was, some of it was being used towards conformity, but I think we both saw how it could be used to support kids following their interests, building interest-based communities around it. And it's not that it was one way or the other. It was both were possible with the internet and with social media. And I do think the same will happen with AI, and it'll just it'll amplify both the benefits and the problems associated with it. It might make them stronger. Both, I hope there'll be greater opportunities for helping kids make those connections, but there also could be greater pressures from various forces towards conformity. So I think there's a lot of people in society are going to have to work hard to try to make sure it gets which it is that gets amplified and highlighted.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, maybe we can end up with, I was going to just ask, there's a lot of different issues swirling around with for teachers and parents who are now confused because there's so much that's going on with new technologies, AI, but also other things as well. And also societal changes that makes it real challenging to think about how to engage, how teachers, parents, others can engage with kids. If you want to encapsulate advice that you would give to somebody who's feeling uncertain and they just want to get some sort of guidelines and so or some visions about how they can sort of help think about these things as they're working with the young people in their lives, what would you give as advice?
I think at a high level, when I'm thinking about the very challenging position that parents and educators are in right now, the high level principle is I would prioritize connection over control. So there's a lot of energy being put into control right now and banning technology and limiting access and regulating access because of all the fears and risks. And in a period when there's so much uncertainty, I think that the most protective and supportive and opportunity enhancing thing that we as elders can do is really have a strong foundation of trust and belonging and connection with the young people in our lives, because that we know from all of the research is what buffers and protects against these ultimately unpredictable risks and changes in the broader environment. And there certainly is, huge trends towards kind of polarization, disconnection, around there's mental health issues, not just among young people, but among grown-ups as well. And I think we have a tendency to rush towards techno-solutionist approaches, both on the positives and negatives, rather than falling back on what we know is good for kids. What we know is good for people is to feel a connection with their communities, with their loved ones, to have a sense of purpose and belonging. Those are the most important things that create not only a healthy brain and mind, but also healthy communities. So I find it really troubling right now that we have such a dominant narrative that is technologically determinist and looks to technologies for solutions. And a lot of times those on the critical side are actually also technology solutionists. So we're complaining about big tech companies and how they think that dropping some new learning platform into schools will solve all the problems of schooling, and that's like a bad techno-solutionist approach, or that somehow if you have some new metaverse, it's going to solve, all of these workplace issues. And that is techno-solutionist thinking. But it's also techno-solutionist thinking to think that if you ban a cell phone in schools, it's going to solve all the social connection, mental health, and learning problems. Like that is also techno-solutionist magical thinking. And I think we have to get beyond that back and forth about is the technology good and bad, and really focus on the social, cultural, institutional stuff that's happening in our everyday lives and how technology intersects with that to support it or hinder it, rather than looking always to technology as both the problem and solution.
I think that's great advice. And thanks so much for sharing that. And it was great to have this conversation with you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mitch.
The Lifelong Kindergarten podcast is produced by Mitch Resnick and Eric Schelling in the Lifelong Kindergarten Research Group at the MIT Media Lab. You can find other episodes, additional resources, and online conversation in our Substack at bit.ly/LLK podcast.